Yeah, good morning. I first wanted to give a shout out to Danny Chandler and Paul Fisher down here in the front row. On Friday, after the Supreme Court decision, they sent out a quick note saying we're going to have a flash party celebrating the Supreme Court's decision. And if you were watching Fox 59 or CBS 4 on Friday night, you saw their party, the two of them, interviewed about just what it meant, to them on Friday. Now, I had been preparing a talk on the word prayer. I decided to turn it into an acronym. But in light of what happened on Friday, and I was talking to one of the great oracles of God, my wife, Reverend Carla, yesterday, and it's because on Friday I went ahead and posted a talk that I did back in April of 2013 when the Supreme Court was considering, two decisions, two different cases on gay rights and gay marriage. And so I quick posted that again on our audio and video files tab on our website, unityofindy.com, along with the article that I'd written, which was actually a chapter of a book manuscript that I wrote. So in that case, I thought, well, why don't I shift gears here and just kind of update that Sunday lesson, especially for those of you who didn't hear it. Unity's always kind of been an interesting denomination. We're 125 years old. This congregation is 100 years old. And we were one of the first congregations that welcomed LGBT. Now, there are other denominations that have welcomed them, but they say, we'll welcome you, but you have to change your ways. In other words, you have to change who you are. Unity has always been, no. You are who you are. And as I watched some of the chatter on social media especially, after Friday's decision, I kept hearing, some of these people stuff, well, the Bible says, and the Bible says this, and the Bible says that. So I want to tell you what really is in the Bible. So the title is A Minister's Biblical Defense of Gay Marriage. And I want to start by talking about a man who was in great political power, and there was a group that wanted equal rights, and he was very much afraid of them. And he wrote something, and I want you to see who you think who wrote this about. I'm going to have Candy put up a slide. There, flushed with the banquet, after such feasting and drinking, they began to burn with passions. The light is extinguished, and with it, common knowledge of their actions. In the shameless dark with unspeakable lust, they copulate in random unions. So what group of people do you think he was writing about? This was from Marcus Cornelius Fonto. It was in the 2nd century, and he was writing about that decrepit group, Christians. Throughout history, there have been people who are in power and people who are oppressed. There are governments, oligarchies, theocracies, or just the plain greedy that would rather shift the blame for society's ills onto a particular group, make them the straw man. So they use archetypes, primordial themes that provoke fear and appeal to your sense of justice. I'm going to ask Candy to put up the next slide. And if you think about it, these arguments have been used through the centuries. They will recruit, kidnap, and brainwash our children. They talk about activating your sense of fear and justice. They are less than human, animals that should be revived. They are sexual deviants out of control and spreading diseases. They are insane and or traitors intent on overthrowing our way of life. They are insincere. They have no compassion. They are only in it to make money. And if you notice, these last 4 have been spoken about our president over the last 6 years. These are bogus stories, and they are used because they work. They trigger your fear response. You need to do something. There needs to be justice. They incite emotional reactions. They stir people to action, to resist the oppressed group. Pour all your energy in over here. It's like the pickpocket on a bus. Create a distraction over here so that I can pick your pocket over here. At some point in world history, these arguments have been used on all races, genders, and continents. Just in the short history of the United States, these arguments were used on the Irish, then on the Italians, then on the Spanish, then on the African Americans, of course homosexuals, and of course now Muslims. You got to have something, some place to channel your energy. Anybody who's ever read 1984, the remarkable book by George Orwell. So, think about how this has been applied to homosexuals. The homosexuals spread disease. They're trying to teach our children that homosexuality is a valid lifestyle. Homosexuality is a disease. Gay marriage will destroy the sacred institution of marriage. Then don't forget about the slippery slope. Gay marriage will lead to polyamory, polygamy, interspecies marriage. People will marry their dogs. A 45-year-old man could marry a 9-year-old boy or a group of boys. Marriage is for procreation. It is the very foundation of the human social order. Homosexuality threatens humanity itself. Don't fall for this crap about anyone, about any group. Thank you, Candy. Now, another tactic, of course, is to call it a lifestyle choice. Now what you need to know is this has been proven over and over again scientifically that this is not a choice. British scientists Dr. Kwasi Raman and Glenn Wilson wrote a book about 7 years ago called Born Gay. It's like accusing someone who is left-handed or someone who has a different skin color than you that there's something wrong. And the fascinating thing about homosexuality and the people who argue the strongest about it is they argue that all a man or woman has to do is to suppress their natural urges and do the right thing. And if you think about it, a person who fits that profile and thinks like that is someone who might be bisexual or truly a deeply closeted gay person. Frustrated by the ridiculous questions hurled at gays and lesbians, Dr. Robert N. Miner, a professor of religious studies at the University of Kansas, unveiled a questionnaire for heterosexuals. Number 1, when and how did you choose your sexual orientation? The Center for Disease Control reports that about 36% of married heterosexuals get divorced. Why is it so difficult for heterosexuals to stay in a long-term relationship? Number 3, about 90% of reported rapes are heterosexual. Why are heterosexuals so sexually aggressive? About 98% of sexual molesters are heterosexuals. Shouldn't we ban heterosexuals from becoming teachers, coaches, and scout leaders? So all of this is well and good, but I promise you to take a look at what the Bible says about all of this. So the first thing I want to do is to start by talking about all of the things that Jesus said about homosexuality. That ends the section about what Jesus said about homosexuality. Jesus didn't say a thing about it. In fact, there's some passages about him kissing the disciple John on the lips, and when John was laying on top of him. I mean, this was an affectionate man. But of course, Leviticus is the one that they like to pull out. So 2 verses in Leviticus are the things especially I've seen rattling around Facebook yesterday. Leviticus 18, chapter 22nd verse. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. And then a couple chapters later, Leviticus 20:13 sounds almost the same. It says, if a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them shall have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them. What about the New Testament, though? If Jesus didn't say anything about it, what about all the letters afterwards? Well, in Paul's letter to the Romans, 1st chapter 26 through 27th verse, Paul says, "For this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions. Their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in their own persons the due penalty for their error." You know, you listen to all of these and you're like, whoa, okay, case closed. Well, not quite. Those of you who are familiar with Unity's approach to the Bible knows that we look at the metaphysical symbolism behind all of the narrative stories. And we also want to make sure we take something within the context of why was this book written and by whom? And make sure we understand the broader message. And of course, you have various translations of the Bible. Since the King James was the version was the first English version, there have been about a dozen various translations of the Bible. But modern Bible scholars reject many of them, accepting especially the one they do approve of is the New Revised Standard Version as being the most accurate. And of course, the words the words have changed connotations over the years. I'm a baby boomer. As many of you know, I'm 58. I remember when I was a kid, the word gay meant I'm very happy. And frankly, you know, when they started using the word gay for homosexuals, you're like, well, if these people are that happy, maybe I need some of that. In 1971, Cistercian monks went into their monastery's archives. They had heard that one of their abbots, the head of the monastery, St. Alred, in the 1000s, had been sainted by the Pope. Yet they could find very little about him in their library. So as they cracked open the archives and found some of the archives that had further protections, they found that this abbot, St. Alred, wrote of his homosexuality. He encouraged monks to passionately share their love for one another. A celebration of gay life is found in literature, poetry, music, and other art forms 1,000 years ago. What happened? In fact, many would be shocked to discover that homosexuality and gay marriages were widely accepted throughout the Roman Empire and throughout the first millennium. It would not be until approximately the year 1150 that the Catholic Church suddenly shifted its attitude and started to persecute homosexuals, Jews, Muslims, and nature-based religions. Problem is, the historians don't know why. And it's probably there in the Vatican archives and library somewhere. So let's go back to the Bible verses. Leviticus is one of the first 5 books of the Bible. It's actually the third. Now, the first 5 books of the Bible are known as the Torah, the giving of the Jewish law, how to be a good Jew. And Leviticus is known as the priest's manual to guide rituals of the early Jews. Chapters 18 and 20, which I read from, are known as the Holiness Code. So this section has a long list of do not statements to prepare ancient Jews to participate in the temple rituals, especially the priests. There is a certain preoccupation with personal hygiene and cleanliness. So a lot of people have noticed, especially in those early books of the Bible, they're over and over again, they're teaching people who are acting like savages to act like civilized human beings. So the act of one man lying with another man is called an abomination. Now, the word abomination is kind of interesting because, there's, of course, people would define it now as just being, just something awful, an unforgivable sin. But there are other things that were also listed as an abomination with the penalty of death in Leviticus. These offenses include eating shellfish, cursing one's parents, touching the skin of a dead pig, committing adultery, having sex with one's mother, mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, or having sex with any woman within 2 weeks of the first day of her menstruation. If a man insists upon following Jewish law, he must follow it completely. And these offenses are just the tip of the iceberg. to be pure enough for ritual worship in the ancient Judah was very, very difficult, let's say. Now, the translation of the word abomination, though, which I touched on a moment ago, meant that you're unworthy of worshiping as a Jew. You are not worthy of partaking in the rituals of the temple. It's that simple. So my guess is a lot of people could live without partaking in the rituals of the Jewish temple. Followers could ignore these Jewish laws and focus simply, in the New Testament, Jesus and Paul both advocated that it wasn't necessary to follow the Jewish law to the letter. It was more important to focus on the fidelity of the soul. So I'll return to the Bible verses of Paul in a few minutes, but first let's look at some of the other Old Testament. In Genesis, and there's the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, God sent 2 angels to Sodom to research the city's evilness, because, as we know, if God is omnipresent, omniscient, and God is all-powerful, all-knowing, everywhere present, God couldn't see as far as Sodom to find out himself. So they spent the night, these 2 angels, at Lot's house. So in Genesis 19th chapter, 4th verse, but before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring us out to them that we may know them." Lot went out the door to the men and shut the door behind them and said to them, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly." Now, for many years, this Bible passage has been used to argue against homosexuality, and that Sodom as a city was destroyed because of homosexuality. But other Old Testament prophets disagree. In the book of Isaiah and in the book of Jeremiah, they both argue that that was not the case. Ezekiel writes that Sodom had too much pride, and they had prosperity, but they did not aid the poor and the needy. Isaiah and Jeremiah argued about that they just did not show hospitality to strangers. But think about that for a minute. Sodom was prosperous, but they did not aid the poor and the needy. Imagine the difference in our national discourse over these last few days. If we were discussing the issue of a prosperous nation not taking care of its poor and needy rather than talking about gay marriage. Jesus did also address this. He cites the sin of inhospitality to the angels rather than homosexuality as the reason that Sodom was destroyed. And as further proof, there are several other incidents in the Old Testament that were similar to this, including one in Judges, 19th chapter, 22nd through 25th verse, in which there was a similar incident, but that city was not destroyed. So there is symbolism here, and it's basically about someone being willful rather than willing to serve. And people just getting all satiated in the 5 senses and forgetting that we are already spiritual beings having a human experience. So when we read the Bible verses that mention sodomites, they're denoting people who lacked compassion, not the other connotation. What about the other references? Well, Genesis 2nd chapter, 19th verse, Jehovah caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and while he slept, he took one of his ribs and closed up the place with flesh. And the rib which Jehovah had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. And then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh, and shall be called woman, because she was taken out of a man. Therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and cleaves to his wife, and they become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." Now, in Unity's approach, looking at the symbolism of the Bible, it's about our own journey. We start with the attitude of the characters in Genesis, and they're all parts of us. So we start from Adam and Eve consciousness, which is what you see is what you get, to the Gospels, where you understand the Christ consciousness, and you end in Revelations, where you're finally releasing all of the things that are within you that are fighting the full embrace of the Christ consciousness. And the Christ consciousness wins. But each character in the Bible represents something. Adam is basic thinking nature. Eve is basic feeling nature. And, of course, all males are thinking nature. All females are emotional nature. So whatever a character in the Bible experiences is similar to what we're experiencing in our own minds, in our own lives. We progress from the most basic awareness to the most grand. The woman was born from the rib, the heart level of a human being. So that means that they were born from compassion of the heart. A human being must have an activated and integrated feeling or emotional nature. When the intellect and compassion are in perfect balance, in other words, are naked, and we're not ashamed, there's no reason to be ashamed. So this is about what happens within the mind of an individual. If your thinking nature severs itself from its feeling nature, you'll probably have a schizophrenic crack-up. Or you might be a sociopath. In the Gospel of Matthew, 19th chapter, 6th verse, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man put asunder. That's what that's all about. You need to be a balanced human being. So let's go back to Paul. Letter to the Romans. In Paul's other letters, he writes to churches that had already been established by him and visited by him. But in this letter, he's writing to a congregation that he neither established nor had visited before. He's planning to visit this group and wants to establish rapport before he gets there, because there is a big argument going on between the Jews and the Gentiles. Jewish law required that people do various things, like we touched on before, to be a Jew. There were people that felt that you had to be confirmed as a Jew before you could become a Christian. And so, there were others, though, that would argue, skip all of that stuff. You can just go straight to being a Christian. That's what's important. So Paul agreed with this viewpoint, but he was also had been an Orthodox Jew. Before he was converted, had his road to Damascus experience. So he was writing ahead, and he decided to start out by appealing to the Jews. And his first chapter is just a rant of all of these awful things that are going on. Awful, awful, awful. A man shall lie with a woman, or with another man as a woman, etc., etc., etc. But then, in the letter to the Romans, 2nd chapter, 23rd verse, he pivots. In 21st century English, he would say, you guys are hypocrites. You're chastising people for doing these things, but you're all doing these things yourself. And then he argues the other side of the argument. And there's the problem with the translation of the words of natural and unnatural acts. What they're really talking about is one's personal character, or if you're in excess of one's personal character. So if you read the entire letter carefully, you'll see that Paul is criticizing heterosexual Gentiles for practicing idolatry. They were worshiping multiple gods rather than the one true God. Conservative Christians need to realize that Paul would chastise them in the same manner, and Jesus would too. Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw the stone. That was from the Gospel of John, 8th chapter, 7th verse. And of course what was happening, a group of people were about to stone a woman to death because she'd been accused of adultery. During the 13 years that Paul wrote, his writing evolved. He criticized impersonal sexual behavior and praised loving, nurturing relationships. Moralists of Paul's time, like Seneca and Plutarch, wrote criticisms of exploitive sex, especially men coercing boys to have sex with them. Roman officers often had sex slaves that were teenage boys. So what was happening was these people were condemning sexual predators. They were condemning sexual predators. And it's important to recognize that none of the Bible writers criticize a loving, nurturing relationship between two men, two women, or a man and a woman. In fact, some Bible scholars wonder about the scope of several fascinating relationships, some among the Bible's heroes. The book of Ruth. Take a look at what Ruth and Naomi, what their relationship was like. The books of Samuel, there are 2 books of Samuel, talk about, of course, King David and his very close friend Jonathan. They had a ceremony to weave their souls together. And in the 2nd book of Samuel, 1st chapter, 25th verse, David laments the death of Jonathan, weeping at his funeral, saying, "Your love to me was wonderful, beyond the love of women. How are the mighty fallen in the midst of battle? Jonathan lies slain upon thy high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me." Which brings us back to Paul. Retired Episcopal Bishop John Shelby Spong, in his book Rescuing the Bible from Fundamentalism, did an exhaustive examination of the writings of Paul. Spong noticed that Paul was an Orthodox Jew who attempted to strictly follow that holiness code in Leviticus. Paul persecuted Christians until he had a spiritual experience and embraced the Christian principles, the ones that he had just been persecuting a few days before. Yet he often wrote of a tortured existence in which he prayed to be saved from his passions. I'm going to ask Candy to put up that next slide. Okay, well, here are some of the things that Paul wrote. "There is a war going on in my body. With my mind I follow one law, but with my body I follow another. Sin dwells in my members, causing me to do things that I do not want to do, and not to do the things I want to do. O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from this body of death?" There is only one reason under the holiness code that Paul's sexual urges would be condemned. Spong wrote, "Nothing else accounts for this data, as well as the possibility that Paul was a gay man." But that wasn't the half of it. Spong also noticed in Paul's later letters, he wrote of attaining a peace of mind after embracing the teachings of Jesus Christ. And I quote, "Thanks be to God, who has given us the victory in Christ Jesus. Now I know that nothing can separate me from the love of God, not even my own nakedness." Spong's stunning conclusion was that Paul found peace of mind, Paul's salvation, in the unconditional love taught by Jesus Christ. Paul did not have to change his homosexual desires because Jesus Christ loved him just as he was. When critics scoffed at Spong's outrageous claims, he responded, "Well, have you noticed there are a lot of things in the Bible that are outrageous claims? How can a Messiah be crucified? How can a virgin give birth?" And that brings us to the Supreme Court. When I originally did this Sunday lesson, in April of 2013, they were considering a couple of things. And then, of course, on Friday, they decided that, indeed, same-gender marriage should be legal in all 50 states. And the one question that really seemed to surface that helped change people's minds is, what harm will come from same-gender marriage? The arguments they were using were the same ones that were used to argue against interracial marriage, integration, civil rights, the abolishment of slavery, giving women the right to vote. Conservative Christians cracked open their Bibles and pointed to stories that included segregation, slavery, and oppressed women, and said, well, if it's in the Bible, we can do it. And I believe that 40 years from now, people will look back shaking their heads, just like we do looking back at the 1960s. For those who argue that same-gender marriage would damage the institution of marriage, there is one institution that gay marriage would destroy, and that is the conservative Christians' interpretation of the Bible. Bible scholar Bishop Spong observed the parallel between conservative Christians and the disciple Paul himself as he faced his conversion from Jewish law to teachings of Jesus Christ, and I quote, "Paul, watching the first Jewish Christians decentralize the law in favor of grace, was not unlike fundamentalists watching his infallible Bible being replaced by an irresistible call into the insecurity of freedom. Paul's response was rage. He wanted to kill, imprison, and persecute. In Paul's mind, the Christians were agents of lawlessness, the devil incarnate. They must be stopped. This is not far from the kind of rage that emanates from television evangelists when they are exposed in the fragile control system that they have so laboriously constructed to keep their own passions in check, and it begins to waver. And I might add a 21-year-old South Carolinian who had been conditioned, I'm convinced, by his parents, not let alone all of these white supremacists, to walk into a church in Charleston because he had to have embraced justice. So what is marriage truly for? You know, I'd probably get a lot of different answers from various people, but in my mind, marriage is for spiritual growth. Two people coming together, being willing to dedicate themselves to growing beyond where they were before. For two people willing to call each other out to be better than they ever were the day before. Now, next Sunday, we're going to stand in solidarity with some Unity churches in other parts of the country. In Texas, this actually started at the San Antonio Unity Church. Texas is one of the states where suddenly Friday, people were able to marry whoever they loved. So they were going to do a wedding ceremony on Sunday, July 5th. Anybody who'd come, we were just going to do a joint wedding ceremony for anybody who wanted to give them a week to get marriage certificates and all. So next Sunday at noon after our service, we're going to do the same. And this is kind of spreading among Unity churches all over the country. So if you'd like to renew your vows, or if you know somebody who would like to come and have a wedding ceremony free of charge, just come, go through the vows, and I'll be glad to sign any marriage certificates that people have. I wanted to close with the final paragraph of the Supreme Court decision on Friday. Justice Anthony Kennedy, who in his essence is pretty much a libertarian and considered a conservative, wrote this, but he has always stood for civil rights of everybody. And his words are just remarkable and will probably be repeated for years to come. Justice Kennedy said, "No union is more profound than marriage, for it embodies the highest ideals of love, fidelity, devotion, sacrifice, and family. In forming a marital union, two people become something greater than once they were. As some of the petitioners in these cases demonstrate, marriage embodies love that may endure even past death. It would misunderstand these men and women to say they disrespect the idea of marriage. Their plea is that they do respect it so deeply that they seek to find its fulfillment for themselves. Their hope is not to be condemned and to live in loneliness, excluded from one of civilization's oldest institutions. They ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law. The Constitution grants them this right. The judgment of the Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit Court is reversed, and it is so ordered. And may you always be open to God's guidance and grace." Well, thank you. It is now time for our tithes and offerings. So take a nice deep breath and considering what it is Unity is all about. You know, for 100 years, this congregation has been inclusive and open-minded. We encourage personal initiative and growth. We are spiritual, holistic, and intuitive. This place is a lighthouse for Central Indiana, encouraging people to go out there and be the best they can be, and giving them the tools to do it. So take what it is you're going to give today and just hold it in your hands. Now, if you give electronically through the Donate tab on the unityofindy.com website, just hold the amount you're giving electronically in your mind. Open your heart and pour love into it.
For whatever we give lovingly, whatever we give unconditionally, releasing without condition, we get back multiplied at least 100 times. Let's say the affirmation on the screen together. Divine love through me blesses and multiplies all that I am, all that I give, and all that I receive.